Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I am Ishita Nagpal, the current chair of AMA DocSIG, and I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you all to the launch of our track discovery series. This is our very first webinar of an exciting three-chapter journey, and this is the second webinar of 2025 and 2026 academic year. Thank you so much for taking out the time and joining the webinar called Mastering the Consumer Behavior Track, a roadmap for PhD students. This session is particularly meaningful to us because it was inspired by you, inspired by all of you as PhD students. Earlier this year, we asked PhD students across programs of what kind of programming would you like DocSIG to do so that we can help you navigate the academic journey. And one theme that stood across all the other responses was understanding what each marketing track entails and how do we position ourselves in one of the buckets or maybe two of the buckets. So we thought your feedback should help us launch something more meaningful. So we launched Track Discovery Series featuring three sessions: consumer behavior, marketing strategy, and quantitative or empirical research. To all our returning DocSIG members, welcome back. To all the new and the first joiners, we welcome you a very warm welcome. As you all know, DocSIG is a vibrant space within American Marketing Association dedicated to empowering PhD students through learning opportunities, mentorship, and professional growth. A huge thank you to Professor Peggy Liu for joining us today and sharing her insights. This means a lot to DocSIG when faculty shares their time and wisdom. So thank you so much, Professor Liu, for doing this for us. Before we dive in, I want to share a quick and exciting update. We heard your feedback and we want to improve how we communicate from DocSIG. So very soon we are going to launch our new initiative called DocSIG Weekly Digest. This is going to be your one-stop solution where you hear from us once a week about webinars, about upcoming conferences, submissions, awards, and everything. So stay tuned, see our LinkedIn, our email campaigns, and you will have some updates soon. Before I give it to Xiaoming, few housekeeping rules. Please make sure your cameras are on if you are comfortable, because it's always good to speak to some familiar faces and not to black tiles. Please stay muted. If you have any questions, please send us on chat publicly or privately to me, and we'll try our level best to answer as many questions as possible. So without further ado, I would hand over to Xiaoming to take this further. Xiaoming, over to you.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. My name is Xiaoying, and currently I'm a PhD candidate from Syracuse University, and I'm also serve as the Vice Chair of this special project and partnership, which basically about the webinar. So, I'm open to any ideas about what other webinars you would like us to cover. And for today, let's start with a question. So, we are all here because we're interested in doing consumer behavior research. So I assume 99.99% of our audience today are interested by that. And consumer behavior is all about how people acquire, use, and dispose of goods and service. So basically how we make choices and why we make them. And consumer behavior research dig into how and why people think, feel, and act the way they do in the marketplace, and when those thoughts and action happen. So what is really cool about this field is how broad it is. It's drawn from psychology, economy, sociology, and more than this. But it always comes back to understand the real human decisions. So many CB researchers use controlled experiments and strong theory, but there's also a lot of space for qualitative and field and also multi-methods work, which I already see that from the questions you submitted. So no matter what style you is, there's a room to find your niche. And today we are very happy that we have Dr. Peggy Liu here with us today. And I'm going to introduce her first, and then she will start to join in about her presentation. So Dr. Liu is the Ben L. Fryer Endowed Chair and Professor of Marketing at the University of Pittsburgh, and she's the leading scholar in experimental consumer behavior, focusing on how people make decisions that impact their health and also social well-being. Her research has been published in top journals including JCR, JMR, JM, Management Science, and Journal of Consumer Psychology, and all and all. And Dr. Liu has received some of the most prestigious awards in our field, like the ACR Early Career Award, SCP Early Career Award, APS Janet Taylor Spence Award, and BSPA New Investigator Awards. And she currently serves as an associate editor at the Journal of Consumer Research. She's also an incredible teacher, very friendly, very helpful, and she has been recognized at the Point and coined as one of the top 50 undergrad business professors and a multiple-time winner of the Excellent in Teaching Award at her institutions. So we're really lucky to have her with us today to share her journey from finding inspiration to shaping ideas to publishing, mentoring, and thriving as a CB scholars. So Dr. Liu, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have you here, and the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Xiaoying and Ishita and Amrita, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really excited to join you all. So I thought that when going through this, I wanted to start out by giving you an overview of what I'll talk about, but as Xiaoying mentioned, I'd want to leave a lot of time for a Q&A. So to start with a caveat, you might all be aware that in CB, a lot of researchers are experimental, but there's also a lot of researchers who are CCT researchers. I'm not a CCT researcher, and so you'll see that reflected in what I'll talk about. I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about why, how, and what I do, and then what I thought I'd do is tell you how 4 different CB papers came about. And when I talk about those, I'll talk about how I came up with the idea, what the journey was from idea to publication, and then talk about how that feeds into an overall research identity. And then I'll briefly say a few things about publishing, conferences, and the job market, but I think a lot of those things will be covered in Q&A too. So this is a circular diagram that some of you might have seen before, but if not, I think it's a really nice way to think about what you're going to pursue as a researcher. And so what why here refers to is really this broad question of why are you inspired to do the work that you do in general? And so starting at a really young age, I remember I actually wanted to be a physician, and I was pre-med my first year. But starting at an early age, I told my parents, like, I really want to do something that relates to consumer health, and I'm really interested in how people interact with each other. So I didn't really know that this was a possible career path. So I thought, okay, physician, that seems about right. And so then when I got to undergrad, so I think all of you are past the undergraduate stage, but as an undergrad, I took medical pre-med courses. And I also took one fun course, and I told myself I'm going to do something that's not, chemistry, biology. And I took intro to psychology, and that was by far my favorite class. And so that was my favorite class. And I thought, okay, I don't really know about whether I still want to stick with being a physician. And I talked to a few different people. One of those people was actually Xiaoying's PhD advisor. He knew my parents. And so I talked to a few different people, and they were actually more quantitative researchers, like quantitative marketing researchers. And I thought, well, I don't want to be a quant modeling researcher, but they said, you might want to look into consumer behavior. And so I went back to my sophomore year. I said, I need to find out more if I actually want to go down this path of being a professor. And so I worked in 3 different labs as an undergraduate. I worked in a public health lab where I was able to work with some amazing public health scholars. I also worked in a social psych lab, and I worked in a marketing lab as well. And so I say this because I think some of the questions that you might have if you're early on are, should I go down not necessarily the marketing path, but within the marketing path, there are so many ways to go. And in the beginning, I played a more exploratory style. So I said, do I like the psych category? Do I like public health? Do I like marketing? And I ultimately liked marketing, and I liked consumer behavior. And one of the key reasons was because I felt like I could still pursue a lot of these questions that are relevant to psychology, that are relevant to public health, and I could do those still as a marketing researcher. So then as a PhD student, I had some fantastic advisors who were very much in marketing. But I also continued to have mentors outside of my core advisors. So I had Peter Ubel and Tanya Chartrand, who were a physician and a social psychologist by training. And I also had marketing mentors outside of Duke, Kelly Hawes and Kate Lamberton. And so going into my years as an assistant professor, what I then tried to do was continue building on this base, but really focus a lot for the purposes of my career to focus primarily on trying to publish most of my efforts in marketing journals. So now let me tell you a little bit more about the what, and the what would be like what actual projects you're going to work on. And so I thought I would tell you a little bit about the story of 4 different papers. And I picked these 4 papers because I think they have some different sources of research ideas. They also have some different journeys that they've gone through as well. So that might give you a sense of like the broad array of places where you might come up with ideas, as well as some stumbling blocks as well. So this paper is a paper that I started thinking about around my 2nd year of the PhD program. And it was really inspired by what I was seeing in part in the literature. So there was a paper about white lies that I thought was really interesting. And I thought, oh, there's this idea that sometimes we might not want to offend other people. So we might try to alter our behavior. And I started thinking a lot about this idea of offense. And when I would go out to restaurants, I'd be like, oh, am I trying to avoid ordering something because I don't want to offend someone else? And so I looked into the literature and I didn't really see a lot on offense. And yet I kept finding myself thinking about offense. And so when I was a PhD student, in our 3rd year, we had to write something called a major area paper. And a major area paper is basically you're tasked with trying to write a big theory paper. And that's the big hallmark of your 3rd year. That was one of the most difficult parts of my entire PhD program. I stayed up like all these nights at a coffee shop, sometimes with friends or with my partner. And I'd be like, I hate this project, is so hard. And I just feel like I was just writing and writing, but it wasn't going anywhere. I finished that paper, and by finished, I mean I had a draft and I turned it into my advisors. But at that time, it was about time to figure out my dissertation. And I still remember I was talking to my advisors and they're like, well, do you want to go on the job market as the offense person? And I was like, well, I don't really know. I don't like negative social interactions with people. And so maybe that's not necessarily what I want to be doing. So I actually stopped working on this project for my 4th year and my 5th year of the PhD program. I kind of was like, well, maybe that was one of those wasted efforts that took up my entire 3rd year. But then as a 1st-year assistant professor, one of my mentors, who was then my senior colleague at Pitt, was Kate Lamberton. And 2016, if you remember, that was the 1st year I was an assistant professor. And 2016, we had a US election. And I saw a lot of these things in the media where people would say, like, I'm offended by this thing or that thing, or calling college students like delicate snowflakes for being too sensitive. And so I thought, this is kind of interesting. Like, now this thing that I've always been interested in, offense, is seeming to be like very commonly seen in the public discourse. And so I asked Kate if she'd be interested in working on that with me. I'd already worked with her before on another project, actually 2 other projects or 3, and I liked working with her. And so I asked her if she'd want to work with me and my advisors, Jim and Gavin. So we resuscitated that project, and that ultimately was published in JCR. So I think that is a nice example of how sometimes you might be working on a paper and you might decide to table it for one reason or another, but I keep a separate list of all my tabled projects. And you might find sometimes that if you keep finding yourself going back to some of those ideas there, you might be able to bring that back sometime as well, especially if some topics come more to the forefront later on. The second idea, or the second paper I wanted to talk to you about, is a paper with one of my good friends, Kate Mim. Kate and I was a 1st-year PhD student, and Kate was a 4th-year PhD student. So we were very close friends. We continue to be close friends. And she would be one of my conference buddies. So we would always like to room together at conferences, and we would like to go out to dinner. And so at one of these conferences, I just started thinking about this thing that happened to us at every conference, which is we would try to arrange dinner together. And one of us would say, like, where do you want to go? And the other person would say, oh, everywhere is good with me. Where do you want to go? And we were always trying to be nice to each other. And yet it felt like neither of us was really getting the response we actually wanted. And so I emailed Kate after one of these conferences and I was like, I think this is kind of interesting. Do you want to work on it together? And so she and I worked on this project together and it was ultimately published at JMR. I think it was rejected before at another journal. And so I think this is an example of thinking about collaborating with people who are not your advisor. We did start this after we had both graduated as well. And, I've had collaborations with other junior people as well that sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't go as well. But this was cool in that both of us were working really actively on this, where sometimes if you're working with your senior advisor, like you're probably doing like the heavy work of doing like the studies and all of that. So this is a third paper. This is one of my only papers that's solo authored. So the idea for this paper came about when I was on maternity leave with my first child in 2018. And so around that time, I had been thinking about this idea in my head that I thought there's a lot of work on what people choose, some work on how much people choose, but there's not as much work on frequency. And so I really wanted to do a project that involved frequency in some way, but I wasn't really sure what. And so in one of those, I think, sleepless mornings, I just started jotting down like random ideas that had to deal with frequency. And this was what came about. And I will say there were some unique aspects of trying to work on a project solo. It's not as fun, in my opinion, as working on projects with other people. And sometimes, I don't know how much I want to do these types of projects going forward. But I think it's an interesting example as well of like, sometimes you might think like, I really want to do a project in something. And I listed a bunch of ideas, I piloted them. And this is the only thing that robustly came out of all of these ideas I brainstormed about frequency. And then the last story I wanted to share about this paper came actually from a conversation that related to industry. And so this is a project that started towards the end of my PhD program. At the time, one of my advisors, Gavin, he had a research center. And as part of this research center, he would have conversations with marketers from industry. And one of the things that some of the marketers, I think some of the CMOs wanted was they wanted to understand, how do people make choices for others? And so in one of our weekly meetings, my advisor just mentioned, oh, they're looking for a white paper on choices for others. And he wasn't even intending for me to offer to write that paper. But when he said that, I started thinking, I told him, I've been doing empirical work on choices for others, and I really wish that I had a conceptual paper to draw from. I feel like I'm doing these ideas that are each kind of interesting, but they're kind of smaller. And I don't really know how to think about this area as a whole. So I told him I wanted to take a stab at writing this paper, but I didn't want it to just be like a white paper that would only be read by industry. I wanted it to be a conceptual paper. This paper probably had the most painful journey across these 4 papers. This paper was first sent to JM. And the first decision we got was a major revision. So I was very happy. The next 3 consecutive decisions were all reject, invite new decisions. So it was very painful. At that point, I was like, oh, this is another situation of I'm an assistant professor and I've spent so much of my time just like preparing version after version that I overhauled each time. And so I thought, okay, I need to like get away from the constant cycle of reject, invite new decisions. So then we submitted it to JCR and it had a very smooth process. And so that I think one thing to think about there is that sometimes the paper needs the right review team. When you get a review team, you're kind of getting a luck of the draw sometimes. And so just because one review team was not the most favorably disposed towards that paper does not mean that another review team might be more positive about it. So these are 4 different papers, and hopefully you can see like the ideas come from all sorts of different places. There's a range of different co-authors, and sometimes it's a smoother process, sometimes a less smooth process. And so, these different projects, each of them I kind of arrived at via a very different route, but I do have a way of putting them onto my overall research identity. And so if you were to look at most of my projects now, they generally fall into topics of social well-being and physical well-being, primarily in health, but sometimes in financial. And so you might wonder, like, was this intentional? And partly yes, partly no. So something that I did starting as a first year PhD student, in part because we were required to do so, but I took it really seriously and continued it after being a PhD student as well, is that every year around May, we had to put together a report. And part of that report was like kind of like a research statement, like write your research statement. Where are you now? And I'm PhD coordinator currently. And so in talking to our own PhD students and my own PhD students, I encourage them to do this as well. I went back to look at my first year report, and it's actually shocking that I had this type of Venn diagram from the very beginning. But something that you might want to think about doing is every year, like create a checkpoint and see where your projects fit. If it doesn't fit in there, I think it's okay. I have some random projects that honestly don't fit in there. But you might see that, you are who you are. So there are some core themes that are probably going to come out. And so that will help you craft your research identity. You can also talk to your advisors about helping you put that together. And one thing that I think is something I like to think about when thinking about what your research identity is going to be is really think about, in some cases, whether you're the consumer in the paper. The papers that I found easiest to write are ones where I'm the consumer in the paper. So I'll give you an illustration where that wasn't the case. So when I was a first year PhD student, I really wanted my advisor to be like, you want your advisor to like what you're doing, and you want your advisor to think that the work you're doing is interesting. So I'd go into our meetings, and if my advisor said, oh, that's interesting, I'd be like, oh, I definitely need to work on it now. But what that led to was I had like 6 or 7 projects in my first year, and some of them were just like not really me. So one project I remember was about bumper stickers. And if you've ever met one of my advisors, he's highly reactant. And so he would be like, oh, this bumper sticker, like it's so annoying they put that. But for me, I wasn't really that consumer. So I found it really hard to generate hypotheses about why it happens, when it happens. And I'd really struggle with that paper. Whereas some of the other papers where I'm like, yeah, I am that person. Why do I behave that way? When would I not behave that way? I feel like that can give you an advantage in some cases when you're thinking about what to work on for a research project. So, sort of taking a step back, that's my general approach to research and my overall research identity. But taking a step back and thinking about the topic of this webinar series, and thinking about like what defines the consumer behavior track, I also had some thoughts there. So one is that in consumer behavior, yes, there is some work that's not necessarily theory driven, and there's a really good paper that looks at that talks about how you can make different types of contributions, and they don't always have to come from a theory gives you these hypotheses that you're going to test. But this is still kind of pretty predominant, and most, if not all, CB researchers do care about theory, if not for every project, then at least for a good number of their projects. And so often, but not exclusively, we draw heavily from theories in psychology. But again, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't think about drawing from other theories depending on your topic. And in fact, some of my favorite areas of work now are thinking about looking at how you can draw from theories in legal theories, how you can draw from philosophy. There are some researchers now that you might have seen who are trying to think about how you can bring philosophy into consumer behavior. So I think it's vital to have a good understanding of theory and psychology, but that doesn't mean you should restrict yourself there. And I think you should also look at theories that came sort of from consumer behavior, not just only ones that came from psychology. Methodologies, as I mentioned, often this is experiments, but there's also an important place to think about writing conceptual papers. And I know there were a lot of questions as well about multi-method papers. How are multi-method papers evaluated? What should we think about with multi-method papers? So I might hold off on that one until we get to the Q&A. And then topics. So I think Xiaoyun gave a really good summary of what broadly the definition of consumer behavior is. But you will see that there is variance across researchers, and there's even variance across editors at our top journals on what they think counts as consumer research. And that can sometimes change from editorial team to editorial team. Right now, the current JCR editorial team has a really nice editorial that I think is really good to read. And you'll see that one of the arguments that they make is that the topics are kind of defined by the community of consumer researchers. So to the extent that like there's a group of consumer researchers that are like, we study that, that kind of helps shift that into becoming a topic for consumer research. And some suggestions that I have when thinking about doing consumer research are first, try to look around in the world, try to read the New York Times, read the Wall Street Journal. I think that's really useful for you. Sometimes to come up with ideas, sometimes to motivate ideas, but that's also helpful for teaching as well. And then something I like to do is I subscribe to the table of contents for all of the top marketing and psychology journals. And when those come into my inbox, I just scan those quickly. That just gives me a sense of kind of the topics that are being published. That'll kind of also give you an idea of the scope of what's considered a consumer research topic or what researchers in psychology are looking at, if that's the discipline that you view as most closely related. And I think that's useful to do instead of only looking for articles that relate to your projects, because this helps you see sort of broader where the field might be going. And so those are some suggestions that I have. And then some of the most important things that are relevant to our careers are thinking about publishing, thinking about conferences, and thinking about the job market. And this is just a slide, a very basic grid. I haven't even filled in the grid, but what I just wanted to highlight are like, these are some common questions and some thoughts on them. So one common question is where to publish, what conferences to go to, where to find a job. And so, and then the second one is when. So like, when is this paper ready to submit to a journal? When is this paper ready to go to a conference? What year in the program should I start thinking about going to conferences? When should I go on the job market? When am I ready for the job market? And the third common question that spans across is, what do I do when I'm rejected? Whether it's from a journal, if what I submitted to a conference is rejected, what happens if I don't have the job? So I think these are some burning questions. I think some of these are going to come up in the Q&A, but maybe just to offer a few thoughts on these general things. So first, where publishing. I think if you've watched some of the other the DocSIG webinars, there's a really good one about different journal lists. I watched that webinar and I thought that was really useful for you. So if you're thinking a lot about that, but talking to your advisor, one of the things that my advisors did extremely well is that early on, every time we had a project, when we were starting the project, we would have this conversation of like, okay, I'm going to write it up. Where might I write this up? And I would ask like, oh, can I ask like, why that journal? Why management science instead of JCR? Like, why would you ever submit there first as a behavioral researcher? And so that taught me a lot about how my advisor was making these decisions, because it kind of seemed like, oh, like I don't really know. And so I think that's something useful to talk about with your senior co-authors and your advisors is like, oh, I'm just curious. Like, I'd love to understand how you make that call. Conferences. I took the approach of I attended a lot of different conferences very early on. And then I kind of figured out the conferences that are most important to me that felt like that was where I fit the best. So now I unless I'm on maternity leave, I go to ACR and SCP. Those are kind of my two core conferences. I think most consumer researchers tend to go to ACR and SCP. And then job market, that one I think is like where to apply. That's a pretty personal decision. I would say if you have that relationship with your advisors, I told them very early on when I went on the job market that where I was looking for was within a certain set of parameters given my personal situation. And so that's more a little bit not specific to CB. But something that is kind of specific is to think about what you need in terms of your resources as a researcher. So if you're going to be an experimental researcher, what does that mean for what types of resources you need at your school? Having a really great behavioral lab is really, really nice if you have that. So think about what some of those things are that you need. The when questions of like, when is it ready to submit? I think people vary a lot on that. And even within people that I work with, some are the type that want to hold on to it really until it's like they want to hold on to it for a long time. And some people are faster to hold on to it. So that's kind of more personal within your set of co-authors. Same thing with conferences, if you want to talk about like that as well. And job market, the when, that's also, I think, a question for advisors. What to do when rejected. So I think this one is pretty important with some of the ideas that the papers that I shared with you about in, let's see, in 3 of the 4 cases, those were all rejected by another top journal before being published at a different top journal. So I think what that suggests is like, you shouldn't get too dejected if a top marketing journal rejects it, that you want to take that feedback really seriously and really reformulate it, because you could very well get some of the same reviewers. But I try not to be too dejected by that. Conferences, I think it's common to get rejected as well. And so usually this is not to so with conferences, I think something to keep in mind is that they haven't even seen your full paper. So if you get rejected from a conference, you should be even less demotivated than when you get rejected on a journal, because they haven't even read your paper. And then for the job market, the whole topic of like, there's all these reasons why you might not have gotten a job. And so I try not to fixate on that if that is the case. And so that's sort of just some overall comments, but I think you've submitted a bunch of more specific questions. So I'll turn it over now to Xiaoying to walk through some of those questions.
Thank you very much. And it's a very nice presentation, and it covers like the majority things that also I can see the pattern from the questions we submitted. And also it's very nice to hear the background story of that 4 top papers. So let me go ahead to sharing this. So I will start with the signature questions for our track discover series. So this question we're gonna ask every speakers. So how and why did marketing field evolve into 3 distinct track, like consumer behavior, marketing strategy, and also quantitative kind of empirical fields? And what factors shape this evolution? And how can today's PhD student best position themselves?
Thank you, Xiaoying. So this question, they told me about this 5 minutes before. And so I think the first part of this question, I'll probably punt that question. That's one probably that my advisor, who's now one of my advisors, is 82 now. He'd probably be best at saying like what historically shaped that evolution. But to the second part of like positioning yourself within or across the tracks, my view is that it's still safest to position within a track rather than across the track. Different people might have different views on this, but I think if you try to say that you're doing 2 tracks, then let's say you want to be both CB and strategy. If you position yourself that way and don't specify which one you primarily are specializing in, I think you run the risk of one of them viewing like the faculty in that area. Let's say a school has all 3 specialties. They might think like, okay, you're neither the best CB researcher nor the best strategy researcher. And so you're kind of held to a really high standard on both, when I feel like it's hard enough to be held to a high standard on one of those. I also think, I don't know if this applies to any of you specifically, but I have some friends in the field, as well as people I know of in the field, who started in one track and then shifted to the other track. So I have a very close friend who started in more of a strategy track and then switched to a combination CB quantitative track. I also have a friend who switched from quantitative really early on to consumer behavior. And my general feel is that the earlier that switch happens, the better. And the other thing is, I think, really think about your skill set, but also who's going to be your advisor or your set of advisors. And if they are strongly on board with your switch as well. So my general view is that really make sure that you are strong within your primary track. And I think it's okay to say, like, I also have some multi-method work that's of relevance to these other areas, and you want to be able to appreciate the other areas so that when you attend seminars, you can ask like reasonable or reasonably understand what's going on in the other areas. But I think I would still try to focus on one.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. So we have kind of like have more than 150 questions submitted, and then I kind of organize, there are a lot of similar questions, and I kind of organize it in under these 4 themes, which is like early career and building research pipeline. Building research pipeline, there are a lot of questions about it, and also about publishing and advancement, and also at the end about some wisdom and mindset. So I'm going to jump right in for our first set of the question, which is about the early career foundation. So the first question, what about quantitative research in CB? So given CB traditional emphasis on experimental approach, how do editor and reviewers evaluate the rigor and value of qualitative consumer research?
Yeah, so as I mentioned up front, I'm not a CCT researcher. So if you are a CCT researcher, you typically get the CC, let's say you submit to JCR, you typically get the CCT editor, a CCT AE, and your reviewers are likely to be, if not all, then at least majority in the CCT work. But something that you might see in multi-method papers is sometimes you'll see, let's say the first study might be a qualitative study, or the pilot study might have qualitative data. And so I think 2 thoughts there. One is that if you have a really important study in your paper that is going to be qualitative, and you position that front and center, and it takes up a considerable amount of space in your paper, I think you need to be prepared to have that evaluated by a qualitative researcher. And in that case, you might even want to think about whether you might want to have a researcher who specializes in qualitative work as a co-author on your paper. There's a nice JCP paper that I'm thinking about. I think the first author is either Sarah Whitley or Jimena Garcia Rada, and they actually have one of their co-authors is a CCT researcher, because that CCT study plays such an important role in that paper. And without knowing how deeply how CCT reviewers are going to respond to that, it's going to be very hard for you, if you're an experimental researcher, to capture all of that. The other possibility, though, is in some of my papers and in some papers that I see now, experimental CB researchers will open with like some quotes in the front end, or they'll have a pilot study with some themes. There, I think if you're just using it for quotes to kind of increase the richness of your experimental paper, I think then you're held to a less high standard. So when you're putting together a paper, I think you do want to think about like who might be the reviewers and what purpose that qualitative data plays. And if you don't think that you want to have CCT reviewers on that paper because you don't have that expertise, you might want to think about having that be positioned, let's say, like as a pilot study and so forth. Should I go into the second question, Xiaoying?
Yes, you can go ahead to like just jump in.
Yeah. So the second question is kind of related. It's generally about multi-method and building a skill set. So I think if you are a consumer behavior researcher and experimental, I would say you definitely want to make sure you master designing a controlled experiment, as like if you don't have that, it's going to be very difficult to do the other things. That's sort of the thing that you have to have. And then if you have increased competency in other methods too, I think that's a strength. But you want to make sure that you're really strong on the experimental method. So a very clean and controlled experiment. In terms of this question about how should PhDs adjust their skill development, I think this is really tricky. I would think about 2 things. One, I would think about like your own skill set. So this is not to say that you can't change your skill set and your skills, but I'll just speak for myself. I think I have decent math stats skills, but am I a modeler? No, I will never be an empirical modeler, and my skill level will never reach that on that dimension. And so that's probably not the route I'm ever going to use. If I really want to have a quantitative modeling component in one of my papers, I'm probably going to collaborate with a quantitative modeler. So you want to think about like what your skill sets are and your background and what skills you think that you can reasonably acquire. I also am a big fan of, I don't know if you would call it like just in time learning or not, but at least for me personally, I feel like I learn the best when I actually have a research project that is going to use a certain method. So I have a really hard time with like, oh, I'm just going to learn this for the sake of it, and maybe I'll use it one day. I think it's good to have some familiarity, but in terms of deeply learning it, I have a hard time unless it's like I'm obsessively thinking about this project and or this data set. And that's the time where I feel like that's an opportunity to really deeply get into developing that skill. I also think that you want to think a little bit about your set of mentors too. So I still remember one of my good friends in PhD told me, like, I actually think in my heart, I am a qualitative researcher, but we're at a school at a PhD program that doesn't have any qualitative researchers. And so I think she made the smart decision not to try to become a qualitative researcher because we just wouldn't have had access to that kind of mentoring. So I think you also want to think about that too. Going into the third question, journal expectations. So I've never done a count. There might be some people who've done a count of like number of experiments required. And I think people generally know that there's been a proliferation in the number compared to like if you read some of the older CB papers, the number of experiments has really shot up. I took a look at one of my most recent papers in a UTD 24 journal, and it had 10 experiments. I would say that at submission time, maybe on average, you tend to see like 5, 6 experiments. But what happens is throughout the review process, you're often asked to do so many things and to answer so many questions that you end up with this proliferation of experiments. So I don't think there's any hard and fast rules. I'm probably one of the people that tends to have a lot of experiments for good or for bad. And sometimes I think I should pare that down. But the real reason why I have so many experiments is sometimes I like to pre-register pretty much all of my experiments. And so with that, I sometimes don't want to have too many things going on in each study because then there's so many, it's hard to like pre-register everything and have everything go as you predict. And so I prefer to have simpler designs, which leads to this proliferation of experiments. The second question there is, what's the cleanest way to prove a CB phenomenon is real while minimizing resource costs and study count? So I think it's a reality that, you might be at a school which has like unlimited resources, but for most people, you have real resource constraints. And so some things I try to do are, one thing is that if I'm going to run a study, let's say I'm going to run a study with dyads in the field, and I'm going to be trying to recruit couples in the field. I try not to just run like one study there. I try to put together a packet that has like 4 or 5 studies that all need couples. And that's a way that you can run a lot of different things, but you only need to have research assistants and compensation for like that period of time. Something else that I like to do is, I think you can think creatively about places where it might not actually cost you that much because people are already there and somewhat of a captive audience. So I'll give you a few examples. One place that I like to use is the farmers market. That's a place where you can recruit people that are kind of like, they're not super busy. And so you can give them some pretty small compensation to do a study. I used to in graduate school, I went to a school that was a heavy basketball school. So people used to wait in line for basketball tickets. And so I would survey people in the line while they were waiting to line up to go to the basketball game, and their compensation would be the snack that they get. And that's actually part of my DV. And so it actually wasn't that expensive at all to do that. So I think you can think creatively about some of those things as well.
That's very good, like smart way to do it for the like third questions. That's very creative. And now we move to our second topic, like another set of the questions. So which is about the building research pipeline. I get a lot of questions about this. So the first one about idea generation, and then the second one is about how you maintain the momentum, and the third one, research pipeline, how you get so productive.
So the first one about research idea generation, you probably saw some of that with the different stories of different papers. But I think the question of like, is it quote unquote worthy of a top journal is challenging. I think I like to think of ideas now where I'm like, okay, does it have potential? Does it ultimately end up there? Not always. But how do you identify which ones are worth developing versus bias perception? I think it's hard for an author not to be biased by their ideas. But for me, what I usually do is when I have an idea, I will try to write a one paragraph contribution statement. If you're not sure what a contribution statement looks like, if you go to JCR, you can see like their contribution statement guidelines and examples. I try to write that even when I don't have any data. So it'll be something like, um, this observation in the literature or in life. In the present research, I look at how X affects Y, and I find that the effect occurs because this and reverses under this case, and this research contributes to this literature because it changes this conclusion and it has this practical implication. And that helps me kind of get a sense of whether I feel like I could write a strong contribution statement. So that's usually what I do. I think as a PhD student, it's useful to develop that contribution statement and to share that with your advisor or whoever your senior co-author is, because they can also help you judge. You can say like, hey, this is what I'm envisioning. Like, do you think this contribution statement is accurate based on what you know about the literature? And do you also think it's like a sufficiently large contribution as well? The second question about maintaining momentum and how to make things happen without feeling bored or frustrated. I think that's where if you start by choosing like a burning question or a question where you're the consumer, it's easier to not feel bored. Like the projects that I've felt most bored by are really ones where I'm not that person in the paper, like, the person who gets offended by bumper stickers. And so I think if you choose, and I'll go back to the offense paper as well. You could probably, like most projects, you probably get to a point where you are frustrated with it. When that happens, I do just kind of set it aside for a little bit. The paper I'm probably working on most obsessively right now is one where I took the last month away from it because I wasn't feeling super inspired. But then yesterday, like I wrote the whole day for it. So I'll come back to those papers. Time management strategies. This has shifted from my PhD times. During my PhD times, like I think I would wake up, um, get to work by about like 9:30-ish, and I'd work till like 5, and then I would work again in the evening, and then I'd work on Saturday and half of Sunday. I have kids now, so I have a very regimented work schedule from about like 8:30 or 9 until 4:30 or 5. But the strategies I use now are I block my calendar. Some of you might do this. I have like my Google Calendar is blocked by color. So green is research, yellow is working with my PhD students, blue is teaching, purple is faculty stuff, red is AEing or reviewing, another color for my family stuff. So I color block everything, and that helps me look back and look forward to see like how much time am I generally spending on each of these things that's important to me, or if am I not making enough time for research. I also retroactively color block. So like towards like as the day goes on, if I didn't spend my day a certain way, I just like adjust it so I can kind of like keep myself accountable. So if I earlier today, like what was I doing? I did a little online shopping that I had to do. And so I like marked that in my personal time calendar rather than have it coded as research. The third one about research pipeline, I think that you will build this. This is like such a very personal question. I have a running doc on my computer. It's in the notes thing if you use Apple. And I have it like, I like that because it syncs across my computer and my phone. And so I just like move things around there. So I have like accepted, revisions under review, revisions that I'm working on, things under review, papers, super early stage papers, tabled papers, and tabled ideas. So I kind of like move things back and forth sometimes fluidly. The optimal number, I probably am on the high side of the number of projects I work on. So like I looked back today in preparation for right now, and I have like 20 working things right now. But honestly, the things that I'm like obsessively working on are roughly around 4. Obsessively means like I'm thinking about it like a lot of the time, and I'm really heavily working on it. And I really try to prioritize during the PhD years. I almost always prioritized whatever was a revision. Like, so if I had a revision, I kind of dropped everything else. Sometimes I would just like work obsessively only on one revision for like 2 months and not really focus on other things. Now it's a little bit shifted more where I do that, but I also try to prioritize the work with junior co-authors and PhD students.
I see. Thank you for sharing that numbers. That's 21 is a lot of project. And let's move on the next set of the questions about building cooperation and then also publishing strategy and also job market evaluation.
Yeah, so building collaborations. So I think as a PhD student, you have your advisor and people at your university. I think I would start there. And the reason is that it's, as a PhD student, you do work really hard, but it takes a lot of time and energy for a researcher to mentor you. And so your advisors have already committed to mentoring you. And in terms of reaching out externally, I mentioned earlier that 2 people I worked with outside my university were Kelly Hawes and Kate Lamberton. And I started working with them at the end of my 2nd year of the PhD program. But I actually was introduced to them via my advisor. And so the way that reach out happened was I brought an idea to my advisor, and my advisor said, hey, like this is kind of like in the area of what Kate and Kelly are interested in. And I think you'd really enjoy working with them. So he vouched for me by emailing them. And I think that reduces the risk for an outside researcher to work with you. I think if you think about the perspective of the outside researcher, it's kind of risky for them to work on a project with a PhD student who's not at their institution if that person's advisor isn't on the project. There's all sorts of questions about like their training, their funding, and are they making sufficient dissertation progress? And so I think my personal view is that it's safest to have things generally go through a senior researcher that you're already connected with, like your advisor. But for finding like outside research partners, one of my former PhD students is now an assistant professor. And when she was a PhD student, she was great about like she would go to like the farmers market, or she went to our Goodwill Center and she would just go talk to them. And so that kind of collaboration of trying to like find outside field partners, I think is definitely something that if you're comfortable with doing, can help you like get out of your comfort zone too, because you'll become very comfortable with being rejected. So I think that type of thing might be useful. As far as what skills do senior researchers look for in collaborators? I think a lot of senior researchers, the reality is that when they're senior, they do have a lot of collaborators already. And so that's where I think if you go through your advisor can better figure out, like, is it appropriate to connect with them, like, and provide you with some of that day-to-day guidance that may be hard for someone outside your school to do. For publishing strategy and publishing in top journals. So this one is, I think, pretty challenging. What's the most important thing to do? So maybe I'll start with the second question. The thing I do before submitting to a top journal is, we already talked about like doing the contribution statement really early on, but what I try to do is like, I print out the paper, like on physical paper, and I try to act like a nasty reviewer. And I will try to say like, okay, what are the big picture, huge problems with this paper, and the nitty picky stuff. And so after that, I try to think like, is there anything that we can reasonably do to address some of those concerns? And sometimes like the worst feeling is when you're like, oh, I have like a fundamental problem with this paper. But that's something I try to do before submitting to a journal. And then how to navigate publishing. I think that's something where if you have senior co-authors, they can really help you navigate that process. I think once you go through 1 or 2 of these, review processes and you start developing like skills on how to respond to reviews, what contributions, I wish I knew like a novel contribution, a novel theoretical or practical contribution. Sometimes I think about like who's thinking would this change? And how big of a change is that going to be? And there's an analogy, I'm forgetting where I saw it before, but there was an analogy about a tree and thinking about contributions can be like the trunk of a tree, like a big contribution, or like bigger branches or little tiny twigs. And I think top journals hope that they're not looking for little tiny twigs or leaves, but like some of the broader contributions. And then the third one about job market evaluation. So maybe I'll share a few things that have been red flags for search committees that I've been on. So one is like if someone comes across as like not very excited about their own work, that's a problem for us. Another one is if they're like, oh, my advisor this, my advisor that, then it feels like you're not really owning the work. And so the third one is probably like being very defensive. So, for example, if you know that there's like this other work that kind of is like somewhat close to yours, if you're really defensive about that, that's something that I think is a little that at least on the search committees I've been on doesn't come across as well as if you actually like engage and think about like there are a lot of similarities in this aspect, but where I view it as being different is on this other aspect. And something like I think people sometimes wonder about is like depending on what type of job they want to get, like is my CV ready to go on the job market? And I think that depends to some extent what type of school that you're trying to target. But if I were to say for like a research one school, I think most search committees like to make the bar for being into the first set, they want to see at least one revision at a top journal. That seems to be the most common bar that is used to screen whether participants make it to the first stage Zoom interview.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the thoughts. And because we're running out of time, so the last set of the question I'm just going to ask you. So what will be a good thing 30 seconds to suggest as a PhD student, like not burn out, but still actively work on the things we need to work on?
So I think I'm a big fan of like trying to make things around you, like trying to have positive, like good mental health and well-being. So I work a lot of days in a coffee shop across from my house because I just like the vibe in there. I don't like my quiet office. I I got a cat in PhD because to cope with loneliness. And we would often have game nights and dinner parties during PhD to kind of like keep keep our moods up. And then in terms of the last question on like looking back on that, I think what choices went well or avoid. Oh, that's pretty tricky, I would say. I think the times that I've had the most stress in my career have been when I was working in collaborations where the collaboration was like not going as well as I wanted it to go. And I think just trying to think like, okay, the big picture of things, like let's just get this project done, and then we just won't work together again. But there's no reason to like break our friendship or anything because of that. And then what are the unwritten rules or non-obvious skills for success in CB research? I think I still would go back to like I think it's good to pick topics about which you have like an intuition, but you also want to make sure that it's not something where like you're the only person who's interested in that topic. So have people that you talk to your advisor. I would talk to my partner, some of my friends outside of academia as well, to try to just see like, is this something that also happens to you? If you see the topic kind of popping up in like popular press articles, that's also a signal that people beyond you are also thinking about this general space.
Thank you very much for all the thoughts. So I will pass down to Ishita again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liu, for such an insightful session and for answering so many questions. We are sorry for going 2 minutes above our time. We'll keep it very short. A huge thank you to all of you to join our webinar. Because of all of you, we have a very strong and engaging community. Before we sign off, we have one last announcement. Our next webinar is going to be Strategy Discovery Series with Professor Kimberly Whitler. That session will only be live and will not be recorded, and it's going to be before Thanksgiving on November 14th. So before we all go into festive mode, we'll see each other one last time before Christmas. And trust me, you don't want to miss that webinar as well. It's going to be as engaging as this one was. So thank you once again and have a great day, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.